Kimi wa girlfriend. Beginnings of uncertainty. It all began on an ordinary school day, a day that felt no different from the others. Kento, a young man on the cusp of adulthood, had never imagined that his life would change so suddenly. A casual encounter, a misunderstanding, led him to meet her, the girl who would alter the course of his life. Her name was Aya. At first, Kento thought little of the awkwardness between them. She was just another face in the crowd, someone who seemed out of place in his everyday world. But life, as it always does, had a way of turning the mundane into something unpredictable. It wasn't long before Kento found himself captivated by her presence. Aya was not what he had expected. A quiet girl, reserved in her actions and words. Yet, her gaze held something mysterious, something that Kento couldn't quite decipher. They both carried unspoken burdens, fears, and dreams hidden beneath their surface-level interactions. But even as their paths began to intertwine, neither of them could have anticipated the consequences of their connection. As Kento began to notice Aya more, his thoughts lingered on her in a way that was different from how he thought about the other girls at school. It was subtle at first, the way her smile brightened his day, or how her laughter, though quiet, seemed to resonate with a truth he couldn't ignore. The tension between them, an unspoken understanding, grew stronger with each passing moment. The more Kento tried to understand his feelings, the more confused he became. He hadn't planned for any of this. Relationships were complicated, and he had never been one to rush into things. Yet, when Aya needed him most, when her life seemed to be unraveling, Kento found himself stepping into a role he hadn't asked for. A confidant, a protector. It wasn't that he had any particular feelings for her at first. It was simply that he couldn't stand to see her struggle alone. Growing closer, understanding more. As time passed, the distance between Kento and Aya began to shrink. What started as a simple, fleeting connection began to blossom into something far more profound. Their interactions grew more meaningful, and with each passing day, the understanding between them deepened. Kento realized that Aya was not the quiet, distant girl she appeared to be. Beneath her cool exterior lay a woman filled with hope, fear, and dreams of her own. They shared more than just casual conversations. They talked about their futures, their childhoods, their deepest fears and aspirations. It was during one of these conversations that Kento first truly saw Aya, not as a mysterious figure, but as a person with her own complexities, struggles, and joys. But even as Kento grew closer to Aya, there were still shadows lingering between them, shadows of unspoken words, of feelings left unsaid. Kento struggled with his emotions, unsure of how to approach the situation. Was he simply offering his support as a friend, or was there something deeper at play? His confusion was evident in the way he acted around her. Sometimes distant, sometimes overly attentive, unsure of the balance between kindness and romantic interest. Aya, for her part, remained guarded. Her past experiences had taught her to keep her emotions in check, to protect herself from being hurt again. Yet, there was something about Kento's presence that made her feel safe, something about him that made her want to let her guard down. As their bond grew stronger, the lines between friendship and something more began to blur. The uncertainty of love. The moment of truth finally arrived when Kento realized that his feelings for Aya had evolved beyond mere friendship. He had fallen for her. It was an overwhelming realization, one that shook him to his core. But now that he understood his emotions, the question became, how could he confess them? How could he navigate the delicate balance between expressing his feelings and risking their friendship? Aya too felt the tension in the air. She knew that something had changed between them, but she wasn't sure what it meant. Her own feelings for Kento had grown, though she struggled to admit it even to herself. She had grown to depend on him, to trust him in ways she had never trusted anyone else. But was she ready to take the next step? Their interactions became increasingly complicated, and the space between them seemed to grow larger with each passing day. There was an unspoken distance that neither of them could cross, a barrier they weren't sure how to overcome. As their feelings for each other deepened, the fear of rejection, the fear of destroying the fragile friendship they had built, held them both back. In the midst of this emotional turmoil, Kento found himself questioning everything. Was it worth it? Was it worth risking the friendship they had for something that might not even work out? Yet, in his heart, he knew the answer. Aya had become too important to him to ignore his feelings any longer. It wasn't just about the possibility of love. It was about the connection they shared, the bond that had grown stronger with each passing day, embracing the future together. The decision, when it came, was not dramatic or grand. It was simple, quiet, and filled with uncertainty. Kento finally gathered the courage to express his feelings to Aya. The words came hesitantly at first, then more confidently as he realized that this was the only way forward. He wanted to be with her, to share his life with her, despite the risks, despite the unknowns. Aya, who had always been so composed and guarded, found herself at a loss for words. She had feared this moment, feared what it might mean for them. But deep down, she knew that Kento's feelings mirrored her own. She had come to care for him more than she had ever anticipated, and the thought of losing him, of returning to a life of isolation, was unbearable. They embraced their future, knowing that it wouldn't be easy, knowing that there would be obstacles ahead. But in that moment, as they stood together, there was a quiet understanding between them. No matter what came next, they would face it together. The uncertainty that had once clouded their lives had given way to something more certain. The possibility of love, of companionship, of a future shared. As the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, Kento and Aya continued to grow, not just as individuals but as a couple. Their journey was just beginning, and while they didn't know what the future held, they were ready to face it, side by side, embracing the future together. The decision, when it came, was not dramatic or grand. It was simple, quiet, and filled with uncertainty. Kento finally gathered the courage to express his feelings to Aya. The words came hesitantly at first, then more confidently as he realized that this was the only way forward. He wanted to be with her, to share his life with her, despite the risks, despite the unknowns. Aya, who had always been so composed and guarded, found herself at a loss for words. She had feared this moment, feared what it might mean for them. But deep down, she knew that Kento's feelings mirrored her own. She had come to care for him more than she had ever anticipated, and the thought of losing him, of returning to a life of isolation, was unbearable. They embraced their future, knowing that it wouldn't be easy, knowing that there would be obstacles ahead. But in that moment, as they stood together, there was a quiet understanding between them. No matter what came next, they would face it together. The uncertainty that had once clouded their lives had given way to something more certain. The possibility of love, of companionship, of a future shared. As the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, Kento and Aya continued to grow, not just as individuals but as a couple. Their journey was just beginning, and while they didn't know what the future held, they were ready to face it, side by side. Koi to Dangan. The world was a quiet one for Ryu, a young man who had long since reconciled himself to the reality of a life shaped by his own choices. He wasn't a hero, not in the sense that the stories or movies depicted them, with their grand gestures and destiny-altering actions. Instead, Ryu found himself in a much quieter, more personal battle, one that didn't revolve around saving the world but simply navigating the raw, sometimes unrelenting passage of his own emotions and desires. The day Ryu met the mysterious woman in the dim-lit cafe changed everything. She was like no one he had ever met before. Her presence was striking, not because of her beauty, although that was undeniable, but because of something deeper, something hidden just below the surface. She had an air of defiance, of strength, yet there was a softness to her gaze, a vulnerability that Ryu couldn't ignore. Her name was Reina. At first, their interaction was brief, almost mundane. She was a stranger, and he was a man who had learned long ago not to get too close to strangers. But there was something about Reina that haunted him. As days passed, Ryu found himself replaying their brief conversation in his mind, wondering what it was about her that stirred something inside of him. He had grown used to a solitary existence, had made peace with the silence of his life, but Reina's presence was an intrusion, a welcome one, but an intrusion nonetheless. Reina didn't immediately reveal much about herself. She had secrets, things that made her distant, things that made her unpredictable. Yet, when she spoke, Ryu could hear the raw honesty in her voice. It was as if, for the first time, someone was being real with him, and in that simplicity, there was a strange comfort. But Ryu soon learned that Reina wasn't just a woman who came into his life by chance. She was entangled in a world of danger, one that Ryu couldn't have imagined, one that would soon pull him into its dark, violent depths. She wasn't just running from her past. She was actively being chased. There were forces that wanted her, wanted something from her, and she wasn't sure how long she could keep running. And so, their paths became intertwined. Ryu, ever the reluctant participant, found himself drawn deeper into Reina's world. It wasn't that he wanted to be a part of it. In fact, every instinct told him to stay away. But there was something about Reina that made it impossible to turn back. She wasn't just another face in the crowd. She was someone worth fighting for, someone worth risking everything for. Their relationship, if it could be called that, wasn't one of simple romance. It was complex, fraught with tension and unanswered questions. Ryu wanted to protect her, but the more he learned, the less he understood. What was Reina running from? What did these shadowy figures want with her? And why was he so willing to follow her, even into the heart of danger? As Ryu and Reina grew closer, the stakes became higher. It wasn't just about love anymore, it was about survival. Every moment they shared was underpinned by an ever-present threat, a looming danger that cast a long shadow over their growing bond. Yet, amidst the chaos and violence, something beautiful began to bloom between them, a connection that transcended the darkness around them. But love, as they both knew, was never simple. It wasn't enough to merely feel something for someone. The world had a way of complicating things, of testing their resolve. And as the dangers surrounding them grew, so did the uncertainty of whether they would survive to see another day together. The days that followed were a blur for Ryu. Reina's world had become his, for better or for worse. What began as a reluctant partnership soon transformed into something far deeper, something that neither of them had expected. In the chaos of bullets and danger, of unspoken words and fleeting moments of peace, they found solace in each other's presence. But even as they drew closer, the storm surrounding them seemed inescapable. Ryu began to understand just how fragile life was. He had always been someone who took things in stride, someone who had learned to live with the consequences of his choices. But with Reina, everything was different. Every day with her felt like a countdown, as though time itself was running out. It was clear that Reina had her own demons that were catching up to her with each passing day. She had always been strong, but Ryu could see the cracks in her armor. The guilt weighed on her, the fear of the past catching up to her. Ryu wanted to help, wanted to take that burden from her, but he didn't know how. What Ryu didn't realize was that in his pursuit of Reina, he had also stepped into a world where he was no longer the bystander. He was part of it now, whether he liked it or not. The forces chasing Reina didn't care about his good intentions. To them, he was just another obstacle, another person to remove in order to get to her. As Ryu and Reina's connection grew stronger, so did the threats they faced. The closer they got to the truth of her past, the more danger they found themselves in. There were moments when Ryu questioned everything, why he was putting himself through this, why he was fighting so hard for someone who seemed so out of reach. But the answer was always the same. He cared for her. He couldn't just walk away. Not when everything they had shared had become so much more than a fleeting encounter. Reina, too, had her own internal struggle. She knew she couldn't keep running forever, but she didn't know how to stop. Every choice she made seemed to lead her deeper into the abyss. Yet, even as the darkness closed in, she found herself unable to let go of Ryu. He had become her anchor, the one person who made her feel that maybe, just maybe, there was still something worth fighting for. But the world they inhabited wasn't kind to people like them. They were caught in a game of survival with no rules and no guarantees. Every decision they made seemed to bring them closer to the edge, closer to the point of no return. And yet, neither of them was willing to stop. They both knew that the future was uncertain, that there were no easy answers. But in that uncertainty, they found a kind of peace. In each other, they found a reason to keep going. The story of Ryu and Reina wasn't one of simple love. It was a story of survival, of choices, and of the lengths two people would go to in order to protect what mattered most. The journey they embarked on together was filled with dangers, twists, and moments of quiet reflection. But it was also a journey that brought them closer to understanding themselves and each other. As they faced the forces that sought to tear them apart, they learned what it truly meant to fight. Not just for survival, but for love. The conclusion of their story wasn't written in the stars, nor was it a neatly tied-up ending. Instead, it was a raw, unfinished tale of two people, bound by their experiences, standing together against a world that would do everything it could to break them. Their love wasn't perfect, but it was real, and in the end, that was all that mattered. Kokoro Connect, unseen connections. In the ordinary bustle of their high school life, 5 students from the culture club, Taichi, Iori, Yoshifumi, Kirari, and Himiko, had always found solace in their camaraderie. It was a friendship founded on shared experiences and a mutual understanding of one another's quirks. They weren't the closest group, but they were comfortable. They didn't need anything extraordinary to keep their bond strong, until one day everything changed. It started as a simple, almost harmless event. A mysterious force, an inexplicable occurrence, turned their world upside down. Taichi, who had always been the sensible one, woke up to find himself in someone else's body. But it wasn't just him. One by one, his friends began experiencing the same strange phenomenon. They swapped bodies, experiencing the world through each other's eyes, each facing the discomfort and strange intimacy of living in another person's skin. First, it was disorienting. Taichi found himself navigating the world as Iori, Iori as Himiko, Himiko as Yoshifumi, and so on. The confusion of their identities clashed with the personal revelations that this bizarre occurrence triggered. Emotions ran high as they struggled to make sense of their new reality. What was the purpose of this? Was it punishment or something else entirely? And who or what was responsible for these body swaps? The group's initial reaction was a mixture of shock, confusion, and, inevitably, humor. But as the days went on, they began to realize that this strange phenomenon wasn't just a minor inconvenience. It was a catalyst. The barriers between them, the things they kept hidden beneath the surface, were being stripped away. The emotional distance they had maintained, even in their close-knit group, started to erode as they were forced to confront each other's most intimate thoughts and feelings. The body swaps forced them to live in a way they never had before. Each person was confronted with the raw reality of another's experience, their private fears, their insecurities, and their desires. It was a world where no one could hide from the truth, and it wasn't long before the lines between friendship and something deeper began to blur. As they navigated this new and disorienting world, Taichi found himself grappling with an unsettling truth. His feelings for Iori, which had been casual at best, were becoming more complicated. The deeper connection they forged through these experiences wasn't just about empathy. It was something more, something harder to define. And as his friends struggled with their own shifting emotions, Taichi couldn't help but wonder, what if these feelings, these new connections, were more than just a consequence of their strange predicament? Could something real come out of this surreal situation? Emotional displacement. Days turned into weeks, and the body swaps continued. The initial novelty had worn off, leaving only the stark reality of what these swaps truly meant for each of them. It wasn't just about who was in whose body anymore. It was about confronting the uncomfortable truths that each of them had been avoiding. Iori, who had always been the most outwardly composed, was no longer able to hide the emotional turmoil that had been brewing beneath her calm exterior. Her relationships with the others, especially with Taichi, became more strained as the boundaries between them dissolved. She wasn't sure if she was reacting to the body swap or to the feelings she had long suppressed. Had she always felt something for Taichi, or was it just a byproduct of the situation? The answer wasn't clear, and it frustrated her. The emotional weight she carried was becoming unbearable, and she began pulling away from everyone, unwilling to confront what she had discovered about herself. Taichi, on the other hand, was grappling with his own growing feelings for Iori. He had always cared for her, but now those feelings were no longer as simple as friendship. His heart raced whenever their bodies switched, and he couldn't ignore the tension between them. He began questioning everything, their relationship, his feelings, and the way they had always interacted. But with the constant body swapping, he didn't know what was real anymore. Was this just a fleeting attraction, or was it something deeper? And if it was something deeper, what did that mean for their group dynamic? As the days passed, each member of the group was forced to face the uncomfortable reality of their situation. Yoshifumi, who had always been the playful, carefree one, struggled with his own feelings for Karari, which he had always kept buried. Now that he was forced to experience life in her body, he couldn't ignore the emotional complexity of their connection. He began to see Karari in a new light, and it both scared and exhilarated him. But with that came a growing tension between them, an unspoken awareness of something more, something neither of them had been prepared to deal with. Karari, who had always been a bit of an enigma, found herself struggling with her own feelings of jealousy and inadequacy. She had always prided herself on being in control, but now, in this chaotic world of body swapping, she felt vulnerable. The walls she had carefully built around herself began to crumble, and she found herself relying more and more on her friends, particularly on Taichi. But her growing feelings for him only made everything more complicated, especially when she realized that Iori might feel the same way. The body swapping was no longer just a bizarre inconvenience. It was an emotional minefield. Each of them was wrestling with their own feelings, their own truths, and the weight of what had been exposed in the process. And the more they discovered about each other, the more they realized how little they truly knew about themselves. The burden of understanding. The emotional strain became almost unbearable for the group. What had started as a curious and surreal experience was now a battleground of emotions, desires, and vulnerabilities. The body swaps were no longer just an inconvenience or a source of awkwardness. They were forcing each member of the group to confront the aspects of themselves they had kept hidden for years. For Taichi, the realization that his feelings for Iori had grown into something more was both freeing and terrifying. He was no longer content with simply being by her side as a friend. He wanted something more, but how could he express that? How could he tell her that he had grown to care for her in ways that went beyond their strange predicament? And worse, how could he navigate the growing tension between them when everything they had once taken for granted had been turned upside down? Iori's own internal struggle had reached a breaking point. She had been running from her emotions for so long, but now there was nowhere left to hide. The truth of her feelings for Taichi had become impossible to ignore. She wanted to be with him, but she was afraid. Afraid of how this would change their friendship. Afraid of how the body swapping had blurred the lines between them. Could they really move forward from here, or was this just a fleeting moment brought on by the chaos around them? As the group began to unravel emotionally, they were forced to confront the consequences of their own actions. The body swaps had not just revealed their deepest desires and fears, they had also exposed the cracks in their relationships. The friends they had once known now seemed like strangers, and the world they had once been comfortable in felt unfamiliar and alien. But even as the emotional weight of the situation threatened to tear them apart, something beautiful began to emerge. Despite the confusion, despite the heartache, the bonds they had formed, however imperfect, were undeniable. The truth was that they had come to rely on each other, to trust each other in ways they never had before. Their hearts had been laid bare, and in that vulnerability, they had found something worth fighting for, rekindling hope. In the end, the body swaps had changed them all. What had begun as a chaotic, confusing experience had transformed into something deeper, more meaningful. They had all confronted parts of themselves they had been running from, and in doing so, they had discovered the true nature of their feelings for each other. The swaps finally ceased, leaving the group to face the aftermath of their emotional journey. They were no longer the same people they had been when this all started. They had grown, not just as individuals, but as friends, stronger, more connected, and more aware of the complexities of their emotions. For Taichi and Iori, the road ahead was uncertain. They had both changed, and so had their relationship. But there was a sense of understanding between them now, a shared connection that had been forged through their struggles. Whether they would become more than friends was still unclear, but for the first time, they were both willing to explore what that could mean. The group, though changed, had come through the trials stronger than before. They had learned that connections weren't just about proximity or shared experiences. They were about understanding, about being vulnerable, and about embracing the complexities of each other's hearts. And so, as they moved forward, their bond remained, no longer defined by the strange events that had brought them together, but by the deeper understanding and love they had found in each other.